Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Museum After Hours. I'm Trey Johnson, and I'm thrilled to be back here for another fantastic program. We have an exciting presentation for you all tonight featuring not one, but two Kansas legends, Dave Kendall and Rex Buchanan. Dave Kendall is well known as the host of the long-running series Sunflower Journeys, produced by KTWU in Topeka, and has also served as director of KTWU's production department. Kendall holds a bachelor's degree in cultural geography and a master's degree in media anthropology. In the spring of 2015, Kendall and his wife Laura Mead launched Prairie Hollow Productions, producing 4 full-length documentaries. Kendall's also served as Master of Ceremonies for Symphony in the Flint Hills for over 10 years. Rex Buchanan is Director Emeritus of the Kansas Geological Survey and served as President of the Kansas Association for Conservation and Environmental Education and the Kansas Academy of Science. Buchanan holds an undergraduate degree from Kansas Wesleyan University and graduate degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Buchanan is co-author of several books, the recipient of multiple awards, and is a frequent guest on Kansas Public Radio. Tonight, both of them are teaming up to present clips from 2 recent projects. The Road to Santa Fe tells the story of the Santa Fe Trail and its role in the westward expansion of the United States. The presentation will then move from past to present as Kendall and Buchanan discuss their most recent collaboration, Hot Times in the Heartland. This documentary explores the impact of a changing climate on Kansas and the Great Plains, highlighting the ways in which local residents are dealing with the challenges we face during this critical period of historic significance. We'll have some time after the presentation to answer some questions, so enter those questions into the Q&A feature and we'll get to as many as we can. So with that, I am pleased to welcome both Dave Kendall and Rex Buchanan to the program.
All right. Thanks, Trey. Appreciate it.
Well, yeah, thank you both so much for coming.
Yeah. I'm here in my home at Prairie Hollow, even though it looks like I'm out on the Konza Prairie, which was the scene I videotaped. I shot night before last, so that's kind of what Konza Prairie looks like these days. And Rex, you're home in Lawrence.
I am, and Trey, I didn't realize we were supposed to wear ties for this, so I apologize because I'm dressed about the way I usually am. By the way, Dave, I do want to make it clear before you start in here that you're really the star of this show as far as I'm concerned. You're the one that really is the driving force behind both the documentaries that you're going to talk about. And I sat in on a few interviews and I really appreciated the chance to be involved. But I do want to make it clear that Dave is really, like I said, the sort of the creative instinct and did 99% of the work behind these things. So I just want to be clear up front.
Well, we might let folks in on the secret that we've been pals going back to the late 80s, I guess it is, back to, I think it was the first season of Sunflower Journeys that you helped us with a story about Kansas geology back then.
Yeah, we've known each other for a long time, and I think, for the most part, seem to like each other. I don't mean to get too personal. I like you, Dave. Anyway, and that helps, I think, as you go through this process.
Well, we do have some things in common. We're both Kansas farm boys. We kind of grew up in the same era, and I grew up not too far from the Santa Fe Trail, which is the subject of the first project we worked on. And I don't think you were far from it either, were you?
Right. I grew up in Little River, Kansas, in Rice County, which is actually named after where the trail crossed the Little Arkansas River. And so Santa Fe Trail follows pretty much a lot of today's U.S. Highway 56 in the town that, well, where I grew up on the farm wasn't too far outside of Little River and not very far from Highway 56. And I can tell you, we were very cognizant of that as kids growing up in the 50s and 60s and 70s. That heritage of the trail was apparent to us, and we talked about it a lot growing up. Yeah.
Well, I grew up and went to school in Harrington, which is kind of pretty close to the Santa Fe Trail, and for some reason, we didn't learn about it much in school. And, I would see the historical signs along Highway 56 between Harrington and Council Grove, the Santa Fe Trail crossed here, but I really didn't know anything to speak of about it until we started working on this project. So,
And and I would say, Dave, I don't know that we learned so much about it in school, but there were a number of locations not very far from where I grew up. One was one over west of Lyons where you could see ruts from the Santa Fe Trail. And then very close to where I grew up was what was called the Stone Corral, which was kind of a stone fort along the trail. So while I don't know that we learned so much about it in school, it certainly was part of growing up there and part of the landscape. And everybody was very well aware of it, even if it wasn't part of formal education.
right. I might back up and say that when Joy Brennan first approached me about doing this for this event, she was talking about our climate change documentary and wanted to know if we'd be interested in doing that, and which I was very happy to talk about. But I just didn't see that it would be, I didn't want to get on here without talking about somebody that was very instrumental in my career, and especially in Sunflower Journeys. And I'm speaking of someone that used to be the executive director of the State Historical Society, Jennie Chinn. People may know that she was our series advisors on Sunflower Journeys for many years, and made it into something that was much more than just a travel log. And and since we interviewed her for the Santa Fe Trail story at the museum, the program, I wanted to include her in this presentation. So when we go on to the first video, we're going to use an excerpt from the interview you did with her at the museum. So that's, but that was one of the reasons that we combined the two. But also there's a connection between the Santa Fe Trail and what we're dealing with climate change. And that might be something people might wonder about or think about what the connection could be. But that's one of the things I think we might talk about later on as we move from one topic to the other.
Yeah, that sounds good, Dave. That interview you're talking about with Jennie Chinn. The main thing I remember about that day was how cold it was, and I had like 14 coats on, and she was out there without a coat, and I always felt like such a wimp. Well, I wasn't. I didn't feel like I was, but I was always impressed at her fortitude.
Yeah, yeah, she was great. She was very helpful, and she helped off camera too. I met with her to do a little background research about the trail before we interviewed her. And speaking of the Historical Society and the museum out there, I noted that there's a lot of staff members signed on tonight joining us, and I want to express appreciation to all those folks for over the years helping us pull together some of the items we needed to tell the stories we told on Sunflower Journeys, and going back to the early 80s when I first started making documentaries. So it's a very valuable resource, and didn't have to make so many trips out there as time went on, because Jennie helped them get started with the Kansas Memory Project, where you could go online and access historical photographs that way, which I still do, and I appreciate that service. And I know Jennie deserves some credit for that, from what I understand.
And for what it's worth, Dave, while you're doing that, I saw the list of historical society sites at the beginning, and while they're all great, the one I particularly am fond of is the Pawnee Indian Village location up west of Belleville, which I think is one of the most wonderful museums anywhere, and it's a little bit off the beaten path. Not everybody goes there, but man, do I love that place. That is such a wonderful location. If viewers have not been there, they really owe it to themselves to take a trip up there. If not on the way somewhere, make a special trip, because that is a special place.
Right. And of course, the comm mission is something that figures into this story we're telling tonight with the Santa Fe Trail, and Jennie references that in her interview. So I suppose we ought to get to the first video, and to set the stage a little bit. I don't know how much most folks know about the Santa Fe Trail. I mean, as I say, when I started out, I didn't really know that much about it myself, but I knew that I had an ancestor that had a connection to the Santa Fe Trail, but I didn't know that much about him. I mean, it's not something we talked about growing up on the farm. But my great great grandfather, who was the first person to settle on the land where I grew up, made his way out here from Kentucky on the Santa Fe Trail in 1857, driving one of the wagons, the freight wagons. And apparently he made at least one trip to Santa Fe and back. And in the process, he saw the land in Morris County and thought it looked pretty lucrative, good place to settle in. So he got some property in western Morris County, and actually was the postmaster there for a few years at a place that was officially called Far West, Kansas, which never existed as a town, but it was on the map as Far West. It was a post office at his farm. So anyhow, that was kind of fun to have a personal connection to the Santa Fe Trail through him, and then learn more about the history of the trail as we went down the trail and spoke with historians who knew the story, people like Jennie, like Frances Levine, who was the director of the History Museum in Santa Fe at one point, New Mexico History Museum, before she moved on to St. Louis and became the director of the Missouri Historical Museum. So she also helped us out and helped us tell the story of the trail, along with somebody that I met when I was working on my first independently produced documentary back in 1984. That's Leo Oliva, who at the time was teaching history at Fort Hays State and making a go of it on his family farm. So he helped us tell the story of the family farm in America. And so I was interested when I started doing research about who we'd talk to about the Santa Fe Trail, that Leo was one of the foremost authorities on the trail. And so it was fun to reconnect with him to help tell that story that we did with that Road to Santa Fe story. So I say that to set up our first video clip, which is about 10 or 12 minutes long, showing some highlights from the documentary. Starts out with the intro to the show, and you'll recognize a familiar voice there over the introductory scenes, and you probably will know who that is, so I won't tell you. Then we go into Leo, and Leo provides his outline of an easy way to break down the history of the Santa Fe Trail. It's basically went from 1821 to about 1880 when the railroad finally arrived outside Santa Fe. So Leo will give his quick overview of the various epochs of the trail, the various eras. And then we move on to Jennie, who you interviewed and talked about some of the common misconceptions of the trail. So that's the nature of our first video here. And if I do my job right, I'll go ahead and do a share screen and we'll get into that. Okay. And I seem to have lost one of my Santa Fe Trail stories videos. Hold on a second, folks. Here we go. Hold on a second, I'll be back in a jiffy. Okay, take two. Share screen, it should be there now. Here it is.
In the heart of North America,
All right, you got
the
it.
gateway to the west rises above St. Louis and the Mississippi River. Not far north, the Missouri River flows into the Mississippi. Steamboats once plied these waters, carrying manufactured goods from the east and travelers heading west. Churning their way upstream on the Missouri, they deposited passengers and cargo at landings that spawned new cities. For some, the journey continued westward, following a prairie pathway into land where the Osage, Kaw, and the Pawnee had long roamed in pursuit of large game. Crossing through rolling hills of tall grass, they moved on west to find another river and follow it across the plains. Some then branched off to the southwest, crossing a landscape where water could be in short supply. Others continued on west, stopping by a privately owned trading post before heading up and over a rugged mountain pass. Both routes came together again near a remote army outpost, passing by the remnants of an ancient Pueblo village before descending through the last pass and arriving at their journey's end in Santa Fe.
Unlike the immigrant trails to Oregon and California, the Santa Fe Trail involved the transport of trade goods and a commercial exchange of international extent. It started out in central Missouri, crossing through what was then Indian territory between the United States and Mexico, whose border extended much farther north than it does today. A quarter century later, the U.S. Army marched down the trail to confront Mexican forces, which resulted in a significant expansion of American territory. Commerce on the trail came to an end when the railroads built across the middle of the nation, providing a cheaper and easier mode of transport. For 27 years, I served as the host of a series called Sunflower Journeys, broadcast by public television stations across Kansas and western Missouri. Early on in that series, I produced a short story about the Santa Fe Trail, which in 1987, Congress had designated a National Historic Trail. In this program, we're taking a longer journey through time to explore the historical significance of the trail, reflecting upon the impact it had upon indigenous populations and the manner in which it brought people from a variety of cultures into closer contact with each other. My grandfather's grandfather got a job wrangling mules to pull a freight wagon down the trail not long after he got off the steamboat at Independence, Missouri in 1857. Then he settled down to farm not far off the trail near Council Grove in the territory that would soon become the state of Kansas.
Well, Council Grove is probably one of the key points on the trail. Treaty was signed here with the Osage Indians in 1825 to open the trail so that the Indians gave permission to travelers to not bother them. And then because of the hardwood trees that were here for supplies for axle trees and so on, it became a rendezvous point. And soon after the trail was started, traders would come sort of separately to this point because they felt safe from Indians to this point. And then from this point on, they wanted to be, travel together, provide their own protection. But it was the rendezvous point on the trail for a long period of time.
A founding member of the Santa Fe Trail Association and one of the foremost authorities on the history of the trail, Leo Oliva came to Council Grove to deliver a public presentation about the trail.
I like to say that there are 5 eras to the history of the trail that kind of need to be looked at separately to understand how they developed. And the first period is the 1821 to 1846, the first 25 years or so. It's an international trail between the United States and Mexico. And the international boundary at that time was the Arkansas River. And when you crossed that river, you were in Mexico or New Mexico. Then we have the second period is the Mexican War period. It's the period of conquest, and the United States troops marched over the trail and in other ways went into Mexico. Of course, some went by ship to Veracruz and marched to Mexico City. But much of the territory that was taken from Mexico at the end of the war in 1848 had been occupied by troops that traveled the Santa Fe Trail, went to New Mexico, then they went on to California and occupied California. 3/5 of Mexico was transferred to the United States at the end of that war. In the interwar period, from the Mexican War to the Civil War, is sort of just an expansion of commerce and military activity. For example, we have a mail contract let in 1850 to carry the U.S. mail between Westport, Kansas City area, and Santa Fe. So we have mail service to New Mexico established during that time period. We have other military posts. Then the next era is the Civil War period. There are battles at both ends of the Civil War. The Battle of Glorieta Pass outside Santa Fe in March of 1862 is usually called the Gettysburg of the West because it was the turning point of the war. Then the post-war period is the railroad period, so that would be the final period of the trail, is the replacement with the railroad. But the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe followed the old Santa Fe Trail. 1872, it was at Dodge City, and the town of Dodge City was founded. And then they built into Colorado. They built over Raton Pass, and they were in Las Vegas, New Mexico, 1879, and Santa Fe in 1880, and that's the end of the trail. The railroad had replaced it. And if you look at the trail in those sections, it all makes more sense because each is really a kind of a different focus, and it helps tie it all together.
What do you think the public's biggest misconception about the trail today is?
The thing I hear the most that is the biggest misconception is that it was an immigrant trail and that people were traveling to go live down in the Southwest. And of course that's what the Oregon Trail is, taking the immigrants from the east to the west coast ultimately. And most people confuse the two or don't understand that they were two very different things. So I really still think the idea that the trail, the Santa Fe Trail, was for commerce is not that commonly known among the general public.
But the movies that we've seen and the TV shows that we've seen and the stories that we've read, it's always covered wagons. I mean,
Yes.
that's if you were to ask people about a trail, my guess is for the average person, that's the image that would come.
Yes.
So it's hard for people not to think that
It
way.
is very hard. I think that there's been a great romance with the West, particularly in Hollywood movies, dime novels. It was very prevalent in the early part of the 20th century, in the mid part of the 20th century, and it's hard to not have those images in your head. My experience is there's very little truth in many of those. I think to go back to the reason you're making this film would be that, you know, the Santa Fe Trail is a significant part of westward expansion. When I really sat down and outlined that and looked at the principles that really pushed westward expansion, Kansas is in the middle of all the stories, even to the point of the gold rush was a major factor. And the secondary gold rush was at Pikes Peak, which Kansas owned at that time. So almost all of the stories, the Mexican War is one of those factors for westward expansion. And it's something that was an aha moment for me this year, was like, we can tell this story totally from the perspective of what many historians say is one of the most important movements in American history.
So how does the state of Kansas go about telling that story?
You know, I guess I'm going to turn this question a little bit, is we are in the process of reinterpreting Caw Mission for the bicentennial of the Santa Fe Trail. And we're also in the process of reinterpreting the Kansas Museum of History. And I think what we're trying hard to do today as cultural and historical institutions is to tell the nuanced story. We try to get different voices in. We try to think of it as what it is, which is an international trade route. And that's what makes the Santa Fe Trail a spectacular thing to study and be interested in. And it is as significant as the gold rush. It is as significant as Bleeding Kansas and the Kansas-Nebraska. It is as significant as the Mexican War for the western part of U.S. history. But it is a significant part of this nation and what makes the American nation what it is.
All right, Trey, if you will open up my video, I'll just start talking and assume people can hear me. Here we go. All right. So yeah, I wanted to include a bit about Jennie, and I actually wrote a piece for the Kansas Reflector back not long after she died in the spring of 2022. So I found a number of people that had some fond things to say about her. So if anybody's interested in checking that out, I just looked it up and read it again today myself, and reminded me of just kind of what a sterling person she was, and how much she contributed to our state. She mentioned that the comm mission was being renovated at the time, and that now is complete, as I understand it. I haven't seen it yet. And that it was getting ready for the bicentennial of the trail, which the bicentennial itself was 2021. That was the 200th anniversary of the first successful trading trip down the trail, where the people that took the trade goods didn't get arrested on the other end. But they're going to have another bicentennial celebration in Council Grove next fall in 2025, when the Santa Fe Trail Association has its annual symposium in Council Grove, and Council Grove is looking at that, and the Santa Fe Trail Association, as the bicentennial of the signing of the treaty under the Council Oak there in Council Grove. So for those who were into that sort of thing, it's a good place to go check out the Santa Fe Trail in terms of local history. So Rex, I was going to ask you about the Santa Fe Trail project, and kind of some of the things that were your takeaways from the project in terms of the themes.
Yeah, and a couple things that occur to me, Dave. One is that while we talked with Jennie about sort of common misconceptions, and clearly I would agree, I think most Kansans have struggled with the realization that the Santa Fe Trail was a freight trail as opposed to the immigrant trail, the Oregon Trail. The other thing that I struggle with even now is, and I don't know why I do this, but I tend to think of the Santa Fe Trail as almost a one-way trail, as from east to west. And why my brain struggles to comprehend the west to east portion of the trail, I don't quite understand. And the reason that's important, and you touch on this in the full documentary, is this is not just Eastern U.S. culture affecting the southwestern part of what is today the United States. There is a transfer of both goods and silver and of peoples the other direction. And I don't know why that concept is, I don't know why I think of it the way I do, but I always think of people headed west with goods to sell. Well, there was a lot of influence that came the other direction back up the trail. And that, I think, is an important contribution of what you did here. The other thing I want to mention, Dave, and I don't know when you want to go into the climate change aspect of this. When you first talked about doing this program tonight, I thought, well, wait a minute, what's the connection between Santa Fe Trail and climate change? But there are some, and one, I would argue, one thing to think about in terms of the environmental of the Santa Fe Trail is the environmental impact of that trail. You don't hear quite so much of that outside of academic circles, but certainly the movement of all those wagons, all those animals, particularly oxen, but horses, mules to some extent, camping along Santa Fe Trail, and what they did to the trees, particularly cottonwoods along the trail, the environmental impact of that is even in the 1800s is pretty dramatic and has a pretty dramatic effect on the indigenous folks that are living out there at the time. I think in some respects, you can almost view this as maybe a little bit of the beginning of that somewhat of an environmental transformation that's taken place in the state that then culminates in that conversation that we have about climate change. Am I pushing this too far?
No. I think that's good points. And the other thing that came up for me was the concept of manifest destiny. And you mentioned the indigenous folks along the trail and what happened to them. That was something that was a major factor in the history of the trail. I thought, not only was it a two-way trail, which is an important point to make, that Gene Chavez helped us tell that story, talking about the Hispanic traders on the trail. So that was another thing that's kind of a untold story to some degree, but the impact that it had on indigenous populations and how it was justified through the concept of manifest destiny, that it was, taken for granted that it was kind of God's will for this country to expand into the wilderness, so to speak, and settle the wilderness. We kind of looked at it a little differently these days, looking back at it, and maybe reinterpret it a bit from what it may have been previously. But certainly the environmental impact, as you point out, of the trail. The other thing about the end of the trail, what brought about the, making the Santa Fe Trail obsolete, was when the railroad came along. And of course, the railroad was put in process through the manufacture of steel and through the burning of coal that powered the locomotives that went across the plains. And so that really was kind of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution coming into our part of the world and starting to, add to the greenhouse gases that have continued to accumulate since that time. And so it was kind of the beginning of a new era. And you think about where we're at now with climate change, and its roots really were only about 4 generations in my case, since we started pumping more of such greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So that to me is another perspective on climate change as we, see the connections.
I would also add, Dave, as you get ready to make the transition to talking about the work you did on the climate change documentary, when you asked me to help with the Santa Fe Trail documentary, I would have fully expected there be a lot of Kansas-based folks who knew a lot about the trail, like Leo and like Jennie and various other folks we talked about. The biggest extent of the Santa Fe Trail is in the state of Kansas. So I would have expected there would be a lot of expertise within the state of Kansas about the Santa Fe Trail. When we began work on the documentary about climate change, I knew some of the folks that we were going to wind up talking to, but I don't think I had nearly the appreciation for the range of expertise of folks on the climate change issue that were in effect right in our own backyard, in the same place all the Santa Fe Trail experts were. That was really the quality of folks that we talked to in the climate change thing really was kind of a little bit of a revelation to me. You think of the East Coast and the West Coast and maybe Boulder, Colorado as the locus for where people study climate. I don't think that this part of the world is necessarily what your mind goes to. And yet the range of the folks that we talked to were uniformly pretty exciting, and were very articulate in talking about both the issue and how it affected this part of the world. And I didn't see that coming. And I think it's one of the strengths of what you did with that piece of work.
Well, and of course, what the idea was to kind of localize it. It's a global situation with climate change, but it's for us, what can we do locally, seemed to be the way for us to frame our documentary. So that was something, it was more of a journey of exploration for me too, to find out who was doing something in terms of climate change. And I know something that comes up in the program is the concept of anthropogenic climate change and what that means. And that might be something that you can define for folks. You mentioned that in geology circles, you get this thing, well, climate has always been changing, the weather's always been changing, this is nothing new. That was something you talked about, and I thought is pretty relevant.
Yeah, I don't think it would be much of anybody you could talk to who would say they aren't experiencing climate change. All you got to do is drive down the road and see dead armadillos in places you didn't ever see dead armadillos before, to kind of come to that realization, on top of all the weather events, the heat records in the summer, that sort of thing. I don't think the issue is climate change so much as it is the cause of the climate change. And certainly I think there were, and there still are folks in the community that I work in geology who would say, well, we're familiar with climate change. It's gone on for hundreds of million years. There's nothing really new to see here. Keep on driving. But I do think the majority of folks in the world I work in are probably like the vast majority of folks in the climatological world, who would argue, well, we haven't really seen the scale, and not so much the scale, but the how quickly the climate changes come about, and in the process, and how well it's fit the modeling that the climatologists have sort of predicted it would. There's not a lot of resistance nowadays to that idea of anthropogenic climate change, based on some of the events that we've seen in the last decade or two, I would say.
Well, with that in mind, we'll move on to the next video, focusing on a bit of an excerpt from our Hot Times in the Heartland documentary. And one of the things that it seemed important to do at the outset was to look at the science behind climate change and how we know what's going on and what's causing it. So that's how we started out the program. And so I got another 10 to 12 minute video to show, and we'll see if it's there when I go to share screen. I hope it is. We'll see.
Welcome to the News Hour. New findings out tonight show the main cause of the climate crisis is rapidly getting worse. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere hit record levels in the spring, the highest in more than 4 million years.
The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration also reports the buildup of the heat-trapping gas is accelerating.
Does NOAA have an official position on climate change?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and it matches what the National Climate Assessment says. And the National Climate Assessment, very, very quickly, is something that Congress mandated that we do every 4 or 5 years. And so since about 1990, maybe a little after that, we've put out reports, we being all the federal agencies, academics, and private industry have worked together to put these out. We're in the midst of one now. And that is sort of accumulated information on how our climate has changed and is changing, and looking to future impacts as well as current impacts of what's going on. One of the things we see is the number of record high temperatures that we're hitting far outpaces record low temperatures. There's a definite trend. There's lots of proxy, if you call it proxy data, that really tells us these things. Glaciers melting, in certain areas a lot, and actually fading away over time. Oceans warming, acidity levels in the ocean increasing, sea level rise, things like that.
People in the Midwest probably sort of look at that and go, well, that's not my problem. But flooding events are.
Right.
And so that manifestation, while maybe not as inexorable or clear, is certainly considerable, right?
Well, let's take Katrina, for example, in 2005. It was pretty devastating in New Orleans. And what was it, a few years after that? Harvey in Houston. I happen to know people that have moved from a coastal area to this area for lots of reasons, right? But part of it was they were displaced by sea level rise combined with a major storm like a hurricane or something like that, and they didn't have a place to live. So there is what we call climate migration, and that's going on around the world as well. Places getting too wet, too dry, too hot. That's happening around the world. It's a semi-political issue too, obviously, but that's a manifestation of climate change, for sure. But my job is more to inform adaptation and resilience methodology. In other words, saying, well, it's going to be 10 degrees warmer in 100 years. So what are you going to do about it? Or what can we do about it? because we're already built, it's already built in. The mitigation thing, we need to get to mitigation. Mitigation meaning we need to get all this carbon dioxide out of the air, okay, one way or the other. But we've built in 100 to 1,000 years of warming already. So even if we had zero man-made, if you will, gases, we're still going to see rising temperatures for a while. That's built in because the oceans are like a bank, if you will.
The most recent report, issued by the IPCC, came out with an urgent warning, much more alarming than any of its previous reports.
The new report from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, found that within a decade, the world is likely to miss its goal of holding global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. If or when the planet reaches that level, scientists say Earth will pass tipping points that will lead to catastrophic environmental damage, including dangerous sea level rise, entire species going extinct, and even greater suffering in many nations, especially the poorest. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the time to act is now.
Humanity is on thin ice, and that ice is melting fast.
Ice really is melting all around the Earth. A professor of geology at the University of Kansas, Lee Stearns has been studying the dynamics of glaciers and ice sheets in a number of different places, including Antarctica and Greenland. We spoke with her remotely during a period in which she was away from campus.
One of the things I would like to start with is maybe help people understand why Greenland is so important. How come you hear so much about Greenland when it comes to this whole issue?
My first trip to Greenland was in 2005 as a PhD student, and I'd been studying actually this glacier in the back, Helheim Glacier in East Greenland, for my dissertation, and had been looking at imagery of where the terminus was and how it looked for, I guess, for the preceding 15 years, for however long we had good satellite imagery. And then when we got there, it had retreated 4 miles from the place where it had been stable for the previous 20 years. And that was a really new discovery then, that it could change in a year that quickly. And we also know by looking at other geologic evidence that it has not retreated this far back in at least thousands of years. So it is definitely out of the ordinary what we're seeing now in Greenland. So that's why Greenland has been getting a lot of press.
I guess I also assume just sheer size in this process in terms of Greenland. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, Antarctica holds more ice in it. If all of Antarctica melts, it's 32 meters of sea level rise. If all of Greenland melts, it's 7 meters of sea level rise. So it is the smaller ice sheet, but it's the one that's much more susceptible to melt. I mean, it's a huge ice sheet changing more quickly than Antarctica is. And nobody's saying that the whole thing is going to melt anytime soon. But as we know, very small changes have very large societal impacts. And so, you know, even if it's an increase in a millimeter from one area, that has kind of large scale effects, even for Kansas. You know, we're not worried about flooding from sea level rise, but in terms of ocean circulation, driving some of our weather patterns, in terms of sea level rise impacting the US ports and economy and globally, I think 80% of goods around the world are moved by ship. And so we need ports that are stable and not susceptible to flooding at an increased rate. And so Greenland might feel very far removed, but it's very closely connected to a lot of systems that we depend on.
Yeah, and you know this probably better than I do, but in geology, you get that climate change is nothing new conversation. You hear that all the time. Mm-hmm. But what I think is new is that rate of change thing, right?
Yes, I mean, I don't have the number in front of me, but it's something like, you know, throughout geologic time, it would take 500 or 1,000 years to warm, you know, during the warming cycles, it would take 1,000 years to warm a degree. And now we can do that in 50 years. And again, when I started 20 years ago, we really thought that glaciers responded slowly to a changing climate, you know, that they would slowly kind of get thinner and retreat. And it's been pretty new science to observe them changing very quickly, really calving off large chunks at a time, thinning, 100 meters in a year in some glaciers. Those were not expected. And so a lot of the focus in trying to understand kind of current rates of sea level rise and how the ice sheets are contributing to that and how that's going to change, in the next 50 to 100 years, really rely on how quickly Greenland and Antarctica are responding to a warming climate. So while sea level rise seems far away, since we're in the middle of the country, shifts in weather are also shifts in weather that impact the ice sheets and are impacted by a change in Arctic regions. And so that's linked to the weather that we see here. In particular, sea ice concentration is the biggest change that we're seeing in the Arctic right now. Bright white sea ice reflects a lot of incoming solar radiation. We've seen a huge decrease in the aerial extent of sea ice, let alone the thickness of the sea ice, which is another thing. That formation and melt of sea ice drives a lot of our ocean circulation, which is very important, but also drives a lot of our weather patterns that will impact Kansas.
But I think we need to get better at talking about what this really means, which is a lot of horribly unexpected weather at all the wrong times, storms that are stalled forever. We're seeing it happen. So being able to talk about this phenomenon in different ways that help people to imagine the kind of displacement and destruction that is going to be a commonplace it's a big deal.
So how many years were you at the Climate and Energy Project?
I was only leading the Climate and Energy Project for 4 years, and then I was chair of the board for a couple years after that. But I was really only there for 4 years, and it was a tiny group of us, 5 people, who were ardently, determined to make a difference, not just in the state, but to be able to have Kansas lead the nation in a way that was important. And what we were convinced about was that climate action was taking place on the coasts, right? Lots of things were happening in the upper Midwest as well. It was not happening in the red heart of America. And what we believed, and what I still believe, is that demonstrating that people can take meaningful action regardless of their political beliefs was critically important to giving everybody the sense that this was a problem that could be solved.
The global climate crisis is changing Kansas as we know it and upending my generation's assumptions about a future in our home state.
A few years ago, as he was finishing high school in Lawrence, Evan McHenry wrote an article published in Lawrence Magazine.
As things are shaping up, my generation will be growing into a transformed Kansas, a state scarred by natural disasters, submerged by floods, and shaken by environmental instability. It is deeply distressing that though the effects of climate change are already happening, alarming numbers of adults refuse to acknowledge the problem. Perhaps the issue still seems theoretical to them. Perhaps they believe the expertise and consensus of scientists around the world are up for debate. But for Kansans my age, the climate crisis is an impending reality. Most people my generation tend to accept climate change as like a fact, and I don't really encounter that in people 20, 30 years older than me who, some of them just don't believe in it or just like haven't grown up, with it kind of understood as a fact. I mean, people my generation, some of them probably disagree about what to do about it, and maybe some of them don't believe in it, but it's just something that you kind of accept as like true, and that may be something, a product of like the social spheres that I'm in, but also I just think generally the skepticism extends more heavily in the older generations. The science is settled and the warnings are clear. Older generations will see the first effects of this crisis, and my generation will suffer through it. We are in immediate danger and there is a narrowing window for action. As each day passes, the possibilities for a sustainable future diminish. Those of us whose future is being determined before we have the political or financial clout to determine it for ourselves feel the clock ticking. The problem isn't completely unfixable. We have to act. I wish I could say the outlook is hopeful, but it isn't. And for my generation, it's hard to be optimistic.
So there we have a little excerpt from Hot Times in the Heartland, and that's something that we've had several screenings. We premiered it in February. at Grace Cathedral in Topeka, and it's been broadcast locally on the PBS stations, and we've had a number of screenings. Rex, I thought we might, I wanted to ask you about, your thoughts about the last interview we had in the comments from Evan McHenry. History isn't a static process, and he's looking to the future, which is going to be Kansas history at some point in time. And he's concerned, not optimistic, as he says.
Right, Dave. And I thought both that article that Evan wrote and then the conversation we had, I was really struck by his understanding, how thoughtful he was about it. But he wasn't very optimistic. And yet, when we've done these screenings, Dave, and you've been to more of them than I have been, but almost uniformly, one of the things you and I talked about a little bit prior to this coming out was, how are you going to keep people interested in watching however many minutes a long documentary about something that ultimately is not exactly the most uplifting topic you ever heard of? I mean, it's easy to get discouraged, and a little bit is reflected in the kinds of things that Evan talks about. And yet, when you would show the documentary, I was struck by the crowds walked out with much different reaction. They were much more hopeful. Now, a lot of that was based on clips that you didn't show, some with students from, for example, here in Lawrence, other clips of the kinds of actions that people were taking or that they talked about. So on the one hand, it does come across, I think, as a little bit more hopeful than what you saw out of Evan. But I would also add, Dave, and you and I haven't talked about this at all, but just within the last few weeks, I've seen these various reports that while, in spite of the increased total contributions to energy that you get out of renewables, like particularly wind and solar, total fossil fuel use in the world is greater now than it's ever been. And it isn't because it's because overall energy use is going up. And even if you keep the same percentage of energy in the renewables, the total quantity of fossil fuels is going to be high. So in spite of everything we've talked about, everything we've done, we still tend to be going down the path that Leah talked about when she talked about Greenland. One last point I want to make, Dave, before we go too far down the hopeful side of this. One of the messages that I got from a lot of people that we talked about was, this is not an individual problem. You can't recycle your way out of this. You can't install solar panels on your roof out of this. You can't Prius your way out of this problem. It's going to have to be a collective action, because so much of the contribution comes from transportation and from buildings and from things that, as we as individuals can't control, some big building that is built somewhere. It's going to have to be collective action, not individual action. And collective action a lot of times requires political will and political action. And what I find discouraging, and maybe now I go back to agreeing with Evan, is we have picked a pretty bad time to be politically dysfunctional. Now, maybe there's no good time, but here is an existential problem, and I think we almost all agree it's an existential problem that's going to take a big time solution. And half the country wants to deny that it exists. We talked about what geologists may believe or what scientific community may believe, but clearly there is a big element of the population out there that thinks things are a hoax. And yet, not only that, but then how do you mobilize those people to take political action? We have picked a terrible time to be at each other's throats. So, at the end of the day, I'm still on Evan's side when it comes to that kind of discouraged thing compared to a lot of people we talked to when we walked out. So that may be a long-winded answer to your question. A lot of things there, but I think some important things to think about.
Well, it's a complex situation, and there's a lot of different dimensions to it. And as you said, that people walked out hopeful from the documentary in some ways, and it's because there were other people that I didn't show tonight that are engaged with activities that are addressing this and helping people cope with the stress associated with it, as you learn more about what's going on. But the important thing is to just educate people about this. This is happening. It's serious. It has significant long-term consequences. And we talk about, this the roots of it go back only 4 generations, but what we're talking about within the next few years, if we don't make some serious changes, we're talking about significant different lifestyles on this planet for the next 40 generations. I mean, ice is melting in Greenland and Antarctica and glaciers around the world. And the heat is coming up. We're seeing it, down the Santa Fe Trail, in places out west in the Southwest to California, where the heat waves are just really having an impact right now, all the way up to California or Oregon. And so this is already having a serious impact on people. And we really do need to recognize it's an existential threat and start doing something to address it at the policy level. And one of the other things that came out of the documentary was finding that there are communities like in the metropolitan Kansas City area and in Lawrence, they're developing climate action plans and they're implementing them. And we just need to see more actions along those lines and more proactive responses from legislatures. So,
Yeah,
Trey, any questions coming in at this point, Trey?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are actually joined by Leo Oliva himself. So thanks for tuning in. A few months ago, he did a fantastic presentation here on Museum After Hours, and it's nice to have him back again. But he is asking if you two could comment on overpopulation and a potential solution to the climate crisis.
Well, overpopulation is something that came up when we, in one of our interviews, we interviewed Wes Jackson, who has written a book called Inconvenient Apocalypse. And one thing that he talked about, a little story he told, was about how many people lived on this planet when his older brother was born, which was like 2 billion people. And he said, now we're going on 7 to 8 billion people. And he said, that's the root of our problem. It's like 4 times as many people on the planet as what the carrying capacity is, and that is a serious situation, and that's one of the factors I think need to be taken into consideration.
I'm not sure I quite go down the same road with everybody here, because if you look at long-term demographic changes, no question overpopulation is a problem. But you also see that overpopulation within not too many more decades begin to reverse itself and population totals begin to decline. And you're seeing that in Europe and in the US and a lot of in Japan and a lot of places already. I think in terms of total population, eventually that problem sort of self-corrects. I'm not so sure, so population is part of the issue. I think a lot of it is just simply that the developing world wants to catch up with the developed world in terms of per capita energy consumption. One of the things I think people sort of struggle with also, there's been this sort of standing assumption that energy consumption correlates with economic growth. And you can't have economic growth without increased energy use. And I've heard that argument a lot. And that may be also an argument that, again, that overpopulation isn't as important as how much energy people actually use. But I do think that idea is also maybe less true than people might have thought at one point. I'm not so sure it's an overpopulation problem so much as it is a lifestyle issue. But maybe that, God forbid, I don't want to disagree with Leo. I hate to argue with anybody smarter than I am, but I would argue that I think if you look at demographic trends, they're eventually going to take care of themselves if we do what people have forecast. But I don't know that per capita consumption thing is going to take care of itself.
One thing that comes to my mind about population is that there may be population dispersed differently, as we get more climate refugees, as sea levels rise, or for whatever reason, people are looking for new homes. People are going to be migrating more around the planet, which sometimes I think about, well, Kansas sometimes seems pretty safe in some regards. And will that mean we'll have more people coming our way as they're seeking refuge. At some point in time, that may be a consideration.
So if Evan kind of touched on this a little bit, but what would you say to someone that denies that this is even happening? I mean, not even paying attention to like the man-made issue, but someone that says, nope, not happening. It's always been this way. It's going to be this way forever. How do you get to somebody like that?
What do you say, Rex?
Well, that is a really good question. I was going to say, in my world, the standard approach is to do a PowerPoint presentation and show up a bunch of charts and graphs and data and give the kinds of temperature data that Doug Cluck was talking about, particularly how the lows are much higher than they used to be. And it looks to me like if you look at those numbers, it's pretty dang undeniable. But having said that, I'll also tell you I've been in a number of situations where, presenting the data just does not work anymore. And I think this may go to that sort of political dysfunction thing that I was talking about before, which is, if we can't even agree to how to talk about numbers, heavens, how are we going to talk about, then everybody winds up with a different perception of reality. And if you got a different perception of reality, you're sure as heck going to have a different perception of what to do about a problem. I mean, the first step in solving a problem is to admit you've got one. And if half the population doesn't want to admit it and doesn't want to look at some pretty good numbers, man, that gets difficult. And I think that's a lot of where we are. And for what it's worth, Dave, when people would walk out of your documentary and they were more hopeful, there were times I wanted to grab them by the shoulders and say, hey, were you paying attention here? I mean, I'm not sure what you saw to feel good about, but I didn't see it. And some of it is exactly in that question you just asked about, Trey. If you got half the population that doesn't believe and doesn't want to accept facts, boy, you got a problem.
Well, I mean, so much of this, it is kind of easy to fall into despair when faced with this information. How do you remain positive through this? I know you touched on a few of the positives, collective action, new jobs in industry and things like that. But how do you not get too bogged down in the doom and gloom?
That's the question, and it seems to me it fluctuates like anything else. Motions up and down, and sometimes you get hopeful, and then sometimes you get hit in the face with something else. It's like, oh wow, that didn't see that coming, or it's really unfortunate that we have to deal with so much political dysfunction that's coming up at this time. But the one thing that I think is something that helps me is just getting engaged in some way. And so that's why I got involved in making the documentary and invited Rex to join me on it. Because what can I do? I can make videos. So I made a video about it to get people hopefully talking about it and to raise a little bit of an awareness about what's going on. So I think to the extent that you can engage in some sort of activity, and there are various ways to do that. In the documentary, we had a clip from a guy by the name of Bill McKibbins, who spoke at the Prairie Festival in Salina at the Land Institute a number of years ago. And he's written many books and is the authority on climate change and the response to it. But he started an organization called Third Act with the idea that older people can get involved and need to get involved with this. That Third Act is the title. We've grown up, we've had our jobs, and now we may be in retirement. So it's focused on people 60 years or older. And he's encouraging them and their organizations or chapters springing up around the country where people are actually engaged in protests and whatever actions they can to make a difference. And so that may be part of the solution too, to just start banging on some drums. I mean, Bill McKibbins got arrested yesterday in front of Citibank in New York City as he was part of a protest. But, as he said, he's been arrested hundreds of times and he knows the drill. So, but it's a way of making a point. Sometimes desperate situations call for desperate measures. And anyhow, I think engagement in some form or another is important to deal with some of these otherwise depressing situations that can really bog you down?
I think that's a good question, and I struggle with that myself. I would say one of the things I appreciate about what you've done here, Dave, is if you could fast forward into the future 30, 40, 50 years when neither one of us are going to be around, I think you could at least say to yourself, look, when this was going on, this is what I did to try to help. I made this documentary. I had these conversations. I don't know where these conversations go, but you might have planted a seed that will make a big difference. I think you could look back and say, here was the big issue of our time, and I did what I could, okay? And that may not stave off despair, but it should be satisfying to you. And so that may be part of the answer I've got is you've done, I think, something significant about this very place. And there was a niche there to be filled, and you filled it.
Well, another reason for doing this is that my youngest grandson turned 3 today, and happy birthday to Flynn. And I think about what world is he and his brother and all my other nieces and nephews going to be dealing with in the unfortunately not too distant future, but through their lifetime. And so if we don't do something that while we're here to help them out, I mean, that's malpractice as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I think one of the last questions was, what can we do to help? And you kind of expertly wove that right in. So it's whatever you can do. And I'm very glad that both of you could join us here today and talk about this issue. It's something that is obviously hugely important. And yeah, at the end of the day, you can say that you did your part. So,
right.
But thank you, Rex. Thank you, Dave, so much. We're just almost at time here. But I wanted to say I've been big fans of both of you for a while. So I was pretty excited when I knew I got to do this program. So I'm glad to meet you at least virtually. Love to meet you in person too if our paths ever cross. But thank you again for being with us and taking the time. This has been awesome.
Well, thank you for hosting it. I might just say if anybody's interested in more information about what we did on either of these projects, they're both available online, including transcripts where you can see the verbatim content of what we've done on our website. And the website's called prairiehollow.net. Prairie Hollow, all one word, .net. So you can get access to free transcripts and other videos and if you want, you can get a DVD from Leo of the Santa Fe Trail through the Santa Fe Trail online store, the Last Chance store, as they call it in that association.
All right, everybody.
So, and thanks everybody for joining us.
Yeah, you got to go to prairiehollow.net. You got to buy Leo's DVD. Make everybody here happy. Well,
thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you again. I hope everybody can join us next month. August 14th, 6:30 p.m. to hear Claire Cox talk about decolonizing the Wakarusa Museum. So from all of us here at Museum After Hours, thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next time. Good night, everybody.